But briefly, so as many of you know, I've spent the last 10 years worrying out loud about the effects of religion in our world and the way in which it's shattered our world into competing tribes. And I've really made just three arguments on that front. I've argued that our competing religious doctrines can't possibly be true because of everything we've learned in the last 2,000 years, and they're mutually incompatible as well. So this was Bertrand Russell's brilliant insight that even if we knew we were faced with God's multiple choice exam, and we knew that one of the answers, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, was correct, still most people should expect damnation because they just can't, these are mutually incompatible ideas, and there's just no way they're all true. The other thing I've argued is that these beliefs are on balance harmful because they just divide humanity from itself in ways that generate conflict. And then finally, I've argued that the good things people think they need from religion can be had in other ways, and in ways that don't pose a problem for understanding the world scientifically and don't divide us in sectarian ways. So this book is really my effort to continue that third argument a little further and show that we can have rich spiritual lives and seek out and experience the furthest reaches of the continuum of human well-being without believing anything on insufficient evidence and without paying lip service to the idea that we need to maintain some sectarian affiliation and some fascination with mythology and some pseudoscientific assumptions in order to get that project started. And that really seems to me to be one of the most insidious effects of moderate and liberal religion at this point in history. It even when it seems totally benign or even beneficial, even when it simply causes people to gather in beautiful buildings and think about the mystery of existence and talk about their ethical lives, it carries with it the tacit message that there's no really intellectually defensible way to do this, that you need some measure of infatuation with mythology and some bogus assumptions in order to find a container for your existential hopes and fears and a way of explaining the most transformative experiences that you've had in your life. And that's something that I try to argue against in the book. I don't know if that's a sufficient starting point, if you want to...
So it leaves me more time to ask you my annoying questions.
Yeah.
Great. One of your key arguments in the book is a big one and a counterintuitive one for most people, which is that the self, the I, that is the ridgepole of our lives, the me that is putting my pants on in the morning and making dentist appointments, et cetera, actually is an illusion.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what I don't mean by that. Because we use this word self in many ways, and one way we use it is to refer to the whole person. So it means your body, it means your mind, your autobiographical memory, your emotions, everything about you. That's yourself. And so clearly I'm not saying that people don't exist. People are not illusions. And so I'm really sitting here. There's no problem talking about me as a discrete person in the world. Another way we use this term self is to refer to the feeling that we all have of being located in our heads as the subject of experience. But most of us don't feel identical to our bodies. We feel like we have bodies. We feel like we're riding around in these bodies as though we were a kind of passenger in a vehicle. And we feel behind our eyes. We feel like we exist behind our eyes in a way that we don't exist behind our knees. Our knees are down there. They and the rest of our bodies are property in some strange way, and we feel like we're a locus of consciousness, a subject, a thinker of thoughts, a feeler of feelings inside the head. And there's been research done on this where you ask people to judge when an object is closest to another person, and people judge an object to be closest to that person when you put it near their head as opposed to near their chest or near their toes, and they judge it closest of all when you put the object near their eyes as opposed to the back of their heads. So we feel like we're behind our eyes. We feel like other people are behind their eyes. And when you start to meditate, most people, you close your eyes and you feel like, okay, I'm up here behind my eyes, and now I'm trying to pay attention to the breath or to sensations or to the sound of a mantra or whatever your object of meditation is. And that starting point of feeling like you're the thinker of thoughts and the noticer of everything you can notice is a false view. It doesn't make sense neurologically. We know there's no place in the brain where the ego can be hiding. There's no place, there's no one point where all of the processes that deliver your conscious mental life come together. All of this is distributed over almost the entirety of the brain, and all of these independent processes can be independently interrupted. So there's no one point that could be the seat of the soul, and it's disconfirmable through meditation when you look for it with sufficient rigor. You can actually look for this thing you're calling yourself and fail to find it in a way that's conclusive. You can you can look for the thinker of thoughts and have the sense that there's a thinker in addition to thoughts fall away. You can look for the feeling of that there's a center of experience behind your eyes and have that feeling of center drop away. And this, for lack of a better word, we can call this self-transcendence. And people experience this in a variety of ways, most of which are really haphazard. The people you hear of it very commonly in athletics, where somebody's surfing or they're doing martial arts or they're playing basketball, and for whatever reason, they have a moment where they feel there's no distance between themselves and the task. So they're not thinking about what they should be doing. They're not error correcting. They're not, if they're playing golf, they don't have thoughts in their backswing, and they're just totally at one with that moment of very often physical activity. And those moments become incredibly addictive. That's what people love about athletics, or that's a peak experience certainly for any athlete, to just feel totally at one with their sport. And the problem, however, is that to experience that in a haphazard way gives you absolutely no control over it, and it doesn't become an antidote to your unhappiness in any kind of global sense, because you're left thinking, well, then it's just a matter of surfing. I just have to get back in the water. I got to get the wetsuit on. There's no other way to feel that good. But there is, because meditation actually allows you to recognize that is a property of consciousness that's just intrinsic, that this self is a construct. The self is the feeling of being a self or an ego is what it feels like to be thinking without knowing that you're thinking. And it's it obviously is our default state. It's more or less everyone's default state, but it can be penetrated, and penetrating it has a variety of effects that we can talk about. But it really is the center of the project that I'm calling spirituality or secular spirituality.
Well, I think a lot of people are attracted to meditation because they want to feel calmer, maybe they want to boost their ability to focus, they want to be more mindful, and by which I mean they want to be able to manage their own emotions or not be yanked around by their emotions. In other words, they want to be 10% happier. Yeah. Available at fine books. What's the matter with that? Why are you setting the bar at transcending the self?
Right.
And what's so good about transcending the self?
Right. Well, without denigrating that project, because I think I'll go on to denigrate the project.
With all due respect.
Yeah. Yes. There's absolutely a time and place for just adding another tool in this kind of incremental search for self-improvement. There's nothing wrong with viewing meditation as the best way to reduce stress or to improve your performance. You could be a CEO who just wants to feel more confident before he gives a presentation, or just wants to be able to focus better at a meeting. And meditation will help with that. And there's nothing wrong with just putting a very narrow frame around its prospects and using it for that purpose. But I view, and so that in that case, in the most limited case, we might think of mindfulness as a kind of executive stress ball, where it's just something that is useful, but it doesn't totally reorient your life. I view it more like the Large Hadron Collider. I view it really as a tool to make some fundamental discoveries about the nature of our minds. And some of these discoveries can be hard-won. People can meditate for years without noticing that the self is an illusion, even while trying to discover that the self is an illusion. And this is a bit of a paradox, because some teachings are clearer than others. Some teachings almost encourage you to overlook this insight, and some spell it out very clearly. And in the book, I try to spell it out as clearly as one can in a book. But one of the things is that there's a sense that most people get when they meditate. Well, first, how many people in this room have a meditation practice or have spent any time doing mindfulness? Okay. Well, let's just so that we get on the same page. Yeah, that's not the usual room one stumbles into. But let's just take 2 minutes to do this practice, so that you all know what we're talking about. The act of opening your eyes. I assume most of you closed your eyes. Opening the eyes often imparts the sense to people that something has really changed. So your eyes are closed. You feel like you're just in your head, meditating, somewhat cut off from the world. You're hearing sounds, but you open your eyes and then you think, "Oh, here's the world again. This is the outside of me. I was just focused on the inside of me, but here's the outside of me." But this outside of you is just as inside of you as anything you were noticing with your eyes closed. I'm not saying there's no real world, but your experience of your open-eyed visual field is the same place where you were thinking and feeling the breath. This is as a matter of neurology, your brain, but it is also it's the space in which thoughts are arising. You can demonstrate this to yourself just by visualizing something in this space. You can just visualize a bonfire on stage here, and depending on your powers of visualization, you can you'll see something. It's different. When I say see a bonfire here, that's different from my saying see a 400-pound tomato. There's when you try to see one as opposed to another, there's some kind of flickering phenomenology here. And some people who have really keen powers of visualization can just drop an object there like it's Photoshop. So you're in your mind even when you're in the world, and so you can meditate with your eyes open. There's no reason necessarily to close them. But one thing I'd like to point out about this, and this technique I just showed you is now universally called mindfulness. It's a type of awareness that's practiced in a tradition of meditation called Vipassana, which is the Pali word for insight. And it comes from the Theravada Buddhist tradition, which is the oldest tradition within Buddhism. And one thing to notice about mindfulness is that it's just a clear and non-judgmental attention to the contents of consciousness. You're not doing anything to change your experience. You're not adding any artifice. There's nothing you have to believe in order to do this. All you have to believe is that it makes sense to pay attention to your mind if you want to notice what it's actually like. You can enter this totally from the point of view of scientific hypothesis, that if you use your attention in certain ways or you direct it in a certain area, something interesting might show up. So mindfulness is the tool that many people have adopted as their primary mode of meditation, for one reason, because it's perfectly designed for export beyond the religion of Buddhism into secular scientific culture, and it's now what people mostly study when they study meditation in the lab, and it's what most clinicians recommend, as opposed to some other practice where you are silently repeating a mantra or visualizing a Buddhist deity or doing something else which seems to link up to some tradition that you then have to ask, why would I be focusing on any of that? But this becomes a tool for making some fundamental discoveries about the nature of your own mind, the simplest of which is, and inevitably the first one you encounter as a beginning meditator, is that you are lost in thought 99% of the time. You're just thinking to yourself every moment of every day, and much of this thinking is making you unhappy. Most of what you think is unpleasant. Some of you may be unlike me, but for me, it's like I've been kidnapped by the most boring person on earth and just forced to have the same conversations over and over again. And there is something hallucinatory about this, because you do have the same conversations with yourself over and over and over again, and it doesn't strike you as strange. Whereas just imagine if everyone could hear your thoughts broadcast on a monitor, you would sound completely insane. And yet, these silently to yourself, it doesn't strike you as the hallmark of psychopathology. But from a Buddhist point of view and from a traditional contemplative point of view, it is a kind of psychosis. It is a way of not really understanding in the present moment what your situation is in the world. And the fundamental thing that we're confused about is that we have a permanent, unchanging self riding around inside our heads.
But, okay, up until that last sentence, you were just making my case for me that mindfulness is great, it can really change the way you see the world. But my question is, so why add on top of that the whole illusion of a thinker, right, or a knower behind directing the show? Why is that so important? What will that do for us that we should be striving for it as opposed to just trying to be more mindful?
Right, there's a few things there. One is that it's just true, and it's interesting. It's worth discovering because it's just there to be discovered. It also, for me, the project really is finding another way of capturing the deepest and most transformative experiences people have. So people experience self-transcendence. This is just a fact. And they experience it in various contexts, and certain of these contexts are clearly pathological in that they're framed by crazy and divisive beliefs that cause immense harm in society. So, the guy who's just getting off the bus in Syria right now to join ISIS is undoubtedly having and has had what he considers to be profound experiences. Now, whether he's had clear feelings of self-transcendence or not, there's definitely a more expansive sense of self, just overriding of the normal, egoic, neurotic program that most people feel. And he has peak experiences that are channeled and given substance and given a meaning in the context of really psychotic beliefs or psychopathic beliefs about the wisdom and necessity of murdering infidels and apostates, and so another person goes to Burning Man and has probably a similar range of positive conscious states framed by totally different ideas and in a far more benign context. And other people go to the Kumbh Mela that Tim just mentioned. So the contexts are irreconcilable in terms of the stories people are telling themselves about the significance of their experience. But there's a range of experiences that are kindling these stories, which people find to be the most transformative and the most important experiences in their lives. And because it's just the nature of the case. The ego is a painful illusion. I mean, this sense that we all have of being inside our heads, truly separate from experience, is painful, and this pain motivates people in a variety of ways. And when they find this pain assuaged in the context of divisive and ridiculous ideas, they become mightily attached to those ideas. And sometimes are willing to die for those ideas and to have their children die for those ideas. So I think we need to find an alternate context in which to talk about this end of human experience. And if you're going to talk about that, if you're going to find a way of talking about the ecstasy of a jihadist who's just about to detonate his suicide vest, you need to be talking about more than stress reduction. You need to be talking about more than just what it is an executive is interested in when he takes a mindfulness course. And so you need to capture the whole project that Tibetan lamas who spend years in caves think they have a piece of, and the people of Burning Man think they have a piece of. There's this whole aspiration to experience the full range of positive conscious states and to undermine this sense of just being a skin-encapsulated ego. And it's there to be, that those experiences are there to be had, and yet the traditional ways of talking about them are benign at best and almost never at their best. So
how do we get there? You showed us mindfulness meditation.
Right.
What do we? Most of us who are interested in meditation, we learn basic instructions that you showed us, and we're off to the races.
Yeah.
What else should we be doing to
Yeah.
blow our minds?
Yes.
Other than MDMA.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think I said earlier that this is somewhat paradoxical because it's right on the surface. You get this sense when you learn to meditate. So I just taught you how to meditate, and you close your eyes or not, and you focus. And then there's this expectation that the truth, if you're going to find it, has to be deep within somehow. You have to really drill down on the breath or whatever it is you're paying attention to, and have some highly non-ordinary experience. It can't be close to where you are because you're just neurotic and thinking every moment, and you're struggling with this practice of meditation. It turns out that's a false view. That selflessness is actually a feature of consciousness that's right on the surface, and it's right on the surface in a way that is similar to the optic blind spot. And that's an analogy I've used before. You may have heard me use it. You've all heard about the optic blind spot. You probably had it demonstrated to you in school, where you have a figure and there's a fixation cross on one side and a round circle on the other, and you're supposed to stare at the cross with one eye and close the other. And if you bring the paper or the screen into the right distance from your eye, the round circle will disappear, and it exposes that you have an area in your visual field where you're getting no information. And yet you never notice this, and surely most people in human history have never noticed this, and those of us who know about it go for years without noticing this. But if you close one eye right now and look out at the room, unless you're in the front row, you see a room filled with heads, but someone's going to be missing a head if you close one eye, and you're not going to notice that. And yet it should be possible to notice these things. The blind spot is not deep within. It's not something that it really is. It's almost too close to you to notice. Now, this is analogous to this feature of consciousness and the selflessness of consciousness. And there are other ways to point it out, but again, any way of pointing this out requires that you have enough concentration, enough mindfulness to not be lost in thought when you're asked to look. And so this is something that really only training can give you. But I'll give you another trick that is useful. It actually comes not explicitly from Buddhism, but from an architect, Douglas Harding, who some of you may have heard of. He was influenced by Buddhism. He spent a lot of time studying Zen. He actually was someone who grew up in a fundamentalist cult, essentially, in the UK, and expressed his doubts with sufficient fervor that he got excommunicated, and then he went to India and finally had an experience that he described as having no head. And he was standing at a place called Nagarkot, which is a place near Kathmandu that gives you a beautiful view of the Himalayas. And he was looking at the mountains, and he realized that he didn't perceive his own head. So he says where he knew his head to be, all there was mountains and sky. And this is true of us all the time. If you're other than the front row, you're looking at a room filled with heads, but yours is not one of them. You can't see your head. And if you look for where you know your head to be, if you, as just with your eyes open, looking straight ahead, if you incline your attention to, if you pointed at your own face with your finger, and you try to look in the direction of your own face. Now, again, this seems somewhat paradoxical, but trust me, there's a maneuver there that works. If you look for what's looking, you might discover in that first instant of attempting to turn attention on itself that there's a subtle shift, that there can be a sense of, in Harding's description, of having no head. And some people just can access this by just imagining not having a head. Just try to remove that from your shoulders and realize that the only thing where you know your head to be is the world. But most people find that it's helpful to actually look for what's looking, or look for their own heads. And it's a very subtle gesture of attention. And it's in the first instant of making it with real focus that this shift can happen. But there's a shift of where you will no longer feel like and again, this will only last for a moment or two before your thoughts will intervene, but you'll feel that you're no longer behind your eyes looking out at the world. There'll be this sense of the center having dropped out of experience. And in that instant, it would be true to say that there's only the world. And the world is, and your experience of the world is consciousness. And in traditions, in certain traditions of meditation, this is called the non-duality of this experience is emphasized. They talk about non-dual awareness. So the usual sense of subject-object awareness is, I'm over here looking out across space at that glass. But it's possible to look for what it is I think I am, looking across space at that glass, and to experience in that moment just pure seeing, just no distance from the act of seeing. So there's no seer and seeing a thing seen, there's just pure seeing. And mindfulness can produce that experience but it as it's often taught, it's not taught in a way to emphasize the non-duality. It's more like, in mindfulness, you focus on the glass so closely and so relentlessly that eventually the sense of distance collapses, where you experience moments of pure seeing by dint of the fact that you were so focused. But in Douglas Harding's case, and this is actually echoes other techniques in Buddhism, you actually look for the thinker of thoughts, or look for the observer, and in that instant of looking, notice how that changes the sense of consciousness. But it can be frustrating, because it's not. This is kind of a steep exercise where unless you can get an immediate result, you have a sense of not knowing what to do. Many of you are probably left thinking, what the hell is he talking about? I've got a head, it's right here, and I'm just, I'm inside it, and I don't know what's going on. But there is the antithesis, or the barrier to these insights is thinking without knowing that you're thinking. That is the antithesis of every practice of meditation you would ever learn, whatever its purpose. There's going to be a moment where you're focused on what it is you're trying to focus on, and there will be many, many moments where you're lost in thought and not aware that you're lost in thought. The thought just comes up from behind in some inscrutable way, and it dictates the structure, seemingly, of your subjectivity. If it's a thought of, worry about tomorrow, you're just worrying about tomorrow, and you have you've completely forgotten that you were supposed to be meditating, or that you're even trying to follow me to the end of the sentence. You're just thinking, and it's that automaticity that has to be countered in meditation training of any kind. Which is not to say that we're trying to get rid of thoughts, because thoughts are just going to continually come, and thoughts themselves can become their own objects of meditation. But in the beginning, it's certainly true that the choice seems to be one between actually paying attention to what you want to pay attention to and being lost in thought. And so it's, but there's nothing to do but keep looking. If it's at all interesting to discover this, and you are motivated by, there's sort of two sources of motivation. You can either be interested in how your mind is and what can be discovered about it through introspection, or you can just be suffering and be made interested by the character of your suffering. And Buddhism tends to emphasize the suffering side of the story, probably for good reason, but the engine of your suffering, you'll find, really is your thinking, just over and over and over again about the things that make you unhappy. And so that's breaking that spell is the antidote to a tremendous amount of psychological pain.
And so just to put a fine point on it from a practical standpoint, you would say to those of us who are beginners that we want to start with some mindfulness practice to build our powers of concentration, to be able to notice that we have thoughts and are thinking. Mm-hmm. And then from there, once we have a sort of foundation, we start doing these sort of looking for the self that doesn't exist exercises.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Mindfulness is the necessary condition for really any practice of meditation. Just to know the difference between being lost in thought and being aware of whatever it is that's arising in your experience. That's the only context in which you can really do any practice. Now, there are certain practices that have rather narrow functions, and in Buddhism there are a variety of practices that are called concentration practices, where you're trying to cultivate a specific mind state for a specific purpose, and a very popular one, for obvious reasons, is loving kindness practice, where you're trying to produce the mental state of loving kindness for ultimately all sentient beings, as a way of overriding your tendencies to be judgmental and hateful and selfish and every other mental state that is not loving kindness. And you can tune this emotion up to a remarkable degree and have an experience very much like what people experience on MDMA, where you feel unspeakable love for everyone for no good reason. You're just in that state, and that's a very attractive way to be in the world. But that's a practice where you really do have a goal in mind. You're trying to create a certain mental state and keep it humming along on the hard drive. With mindfulness, you're not trying to do that, and with really any fundamentally deeper form of meditation practice that's trying to get at the intrinsic qualities of consciousness, you're not trying to produce any specific state. You're just trying to recognize how consciousness already is. And so it's not goal-oriented in that way, and that's freeing, but you keep stumbling into subtle corruptions of your practice where though you're not supposed to be trying to change your experience, you are covertly trying to change it. And mindfulness then becomes a tool to feel better, And yet the desire to feel better is itself the same program of seeking happiness that you use in every other area of your life, and you're carrying the disease along with you. You're not accepting the present moment. That's what you want to feel better. You're wanting to feel better is predicated on feeling that this isn't good enough, and that's not mindfulness. It's not. So you can be fooling yourself by strategically paying attention to the breath or to anything else. Or let's say an unpleasant emotion like anger arises, and you are trying to be mindful of it so that it will go away. That's not mindfulness. It can feel, you might get lucky and it'll go away, but the deep insight is to recognize that consciousness is simply the context in which anger and other emotions arise and pass away, and that it never really takes their form. It never really is fully corrupted by anger or improved by joy. And when you can do that, strangely you can kind of have your cake and eat it too there, because when you do that, when you just give up the war with your emotions and with your experience and just let whatever comes come, you find that the unpleasant things just arise and vanish very, very quickly. It's impossible to stay angry for more than a few moments unless you're lost in thought about it. And a very pleasant quality of peace and well-being comes that is kind of intrinsic to consciousness. It's not something, it's not something that has to be manufactured. And it does sort of equalize the extremes of experience, and it's what you wanted in the first place, but it's not had by seeking well-being, and that's you just have to keep getting out of your own way, and mindfulness is the tool to do that.
Before, when I asked, why should we be trying to transcend the self, you did a classic Sam Harris move where you sort of, in your soft voice, said something devastating.
What was that something?
Because it's true.
Oh.
So I was having dinner with my mom the other night, who is a scientist and a meditator and a novice meditator, and familiar with the Buddhist literature, and she was questioning this claim of whether it's true. She said essentially it's a faith claim. We don't have any, just because we can't find it when we close our eyes doesn't mean there's no self. Right. We just don't know. What would you say to my mom? Because I had no idea what to say to my mom.
Well, this is sort of based on the premise that, which we use more or less everywhere in our intellectual lives, that what doesn't survive scrutiny can't be real. That if you keep looking at something and discover that it collapses into something else and it never collapses in the other direction, this is how we detect any visual illusion. So in my public talk on this topic, I put up a visual illusion called the Kaniza Square, where you have, and this is in the book actually, there are 4 partial circles which seem to frame a white square in the middle of the page. There are these 3/4 circles that articulate the corners of the square, but the connecting lines of the square don't exist. It's all just the white page. So your initial visual experience is of seeing, as clear as day, a white square in the middle of this page. But then when you look more closely, you see that there is no square there. The only thing on that page are 4 black partial circles. And so this is a classic visual illusion. And it's incredibly hard to just see the circles and not see the square, because your visual system, its edge detectors have been fooled, and they just keep detecting a square where there's no square. But if you look closely, you can see how the trick is done, and there's just no question that these circles are more real than the square. The square is merely implied, and it does not survive scrutiny. Now, So encountering a skeptic like your mom, I view this as a similar situation, albeit a more esoteric one. It's as though encountering a skeptic who would say, the square is just as real as the circles, as the partial circles. How could prove to me that it's not? In this case, on the diagram, I can actually put a finger on the non-existent edge of the square and say, well, there's no edge here, right? So we can manipulate this in interpersonal space, but and it's harder to do that in getting you to look for your head, for instance. Although that is it's a similar effort. But again, it's the same principle where you would those who put themselves in the best position to look at the thing and look hardest and look longest will converge on this discovery, which is the self you think you have can't be found, and the feeling that there is one is itself a thought, is itself an appearance in consciousness that is uninspected. And you can feel this. Well, you can see this logically because, okay, so the self that you think you have feels like something, right? It feels. If it didn't feel like something, you wouldn't think you had one, right? So it's showing up somehow. You have a feeling of self, but the sheer fact that it's showing up proves that it is among the contents of consciousness. It's an appearance, however inscrutable, in consciousness. It's a feeling of some kind. Otherwise, you wouldn't feel it, right? I'll give you another, maybe an easier to grasp analogy of this. So just consciously move your hand, right? So this is a voluntary gesture that we're all engaged in, and you can stop it at will, and you can start it at will, and you can stop it. Now this is as voluntary as anything ever gets, right? This is you. If you're ever going to be the author of an action, it's this right here that you can start and stop on command. So there's how is it that you differentiate this feeling of authoring this action from an action that just happens to you, like a muscle spasm or something that is clearly involuntary? Well, there's something you're feeling that differentiates them. Otherwise, you wouldn't differentiate them. Otherwise, it would all seem automatic, or it would all seem voluntary. There's got to be some difference between the jerk of a muscle spasm and this thing that you really have dialed in. You're in the driver's seat, and you got this. Now, that feeling is an appearance in consciousness, right? Now, it's probably, to speak in neurobiological terms, it is. Your brain has produced some predictive model of its ensuing output, right? And that predictive model feels like something. It has a kind of internal signature. That's an appearance in consciousness, however difficult it is to define. Again, this is now a logical argument. That by virtue of the fact that it's appearing in consciousness, I would argue to you that consciousness is the prior context of its appearance. That feeling of agency can't really define consciousness. Consciousness must be prior to it, the mere witness of it. So what is that? If that feeling of being a self is just an object in consciousness. Here, I'll give you another sense. So in listening to me talk right now, many of you are having the experience of, it's almost like watching a movie. You're in a darkened theater watching the movie on screen, and you are unimplicated. Unless I make eye contact with you, you don't really feel the sense that you are being seen. You're not self-conscious. I want you, without making a sound at all, just turn and make eye contact, silent eye contact with some stranger around you for 2 seconds. Just do it. Don't hesitate. Just do just a couple of seconds of eye contact. Okay. Sorry, now you're all completely freaked out. Okay, but you probably felt something, right? You felt there's a kind of an intensification of a feeling of self-consciousness, where the moment you know you're going to turn and know that someone at that moment is looking at you, right? Then all of a sudden you feel implicated over here. You are the thing behind your eyes that it can be seen, right? Now, a moment before I said that, you were just sort of in the darkened movie theater, unimplicated, right? That intensification, that feeling, that's an appearance in consciousness. That's showing up, right? That the consciousness is the prior context of that feeling. That's the self. That is what we feel we are, and that gets intensified when we're acutely self-conscious. It gets relaxed when we're watching a movie and we forget we're even watching a movie, and we're just totally enthralled to what we're seeing. And so, again, if you keep falling back into this experience of just witnessing the contents of consciousness, you can discover that the thing that's doing the witnessing, that the consciousness itself, doesn't feel like a self. It doesn't feel like what you're calling I. It just feels like the space in which everything, including the sensation that you have been calling I, is appearing and changing.
So I feel like my mom was being deliberately obtuse, and can I tell her that you feel the same way?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way, but...
So I solicited some questions.
Yeah.
So I'm going to open it up to audience questions in a second, but I solicited some questions on Twitter today, and this was awesome, actually. I'm going to ask you two. First of all, will Ben Stiller play you in the biopic? The real question is there a loss of moral accountability when one loses a self?
I'm still stuck on the Ben Stiller bit. I don't know.
Have I inflamed your sense of self?
No. Well, I don't know if I've told this story before in public. I must have somewhere, but I was once. This was coming up for me a lot, like 10 or 15 years ago, and it comes in cycles. When Ben gets briefly incredibly famous, when he releases a film, there are Ben Stiller sightings that are focused on me, and I've been recognized as Ben Stiller almost as much as I've been recognized as myself. And when this was happening, I went to one of his movies a long time. This was Mystery Men. I don't know what year that came out. And I was thinking, I don't look like Ben Stiller. What is everybody talking about? And I was watching this movie, and about 2/3 of the way through, something diabolical clicked in my brain, and that was my face on his body for the rest of the movie, and I just couldn't shake it. It was like a bad acid trip. So I acknowledge that we.
The headline here is that you see Ben Stiller movies.
Well, yes, not everyone, but yeah. I forgot the other question.
What was your view on Night at the Museum 2?
Yes, I did not see that.
The question was, when one loses a sense of self, does one lose moral accountability?
Right. No. Well, this actually goes to the other side of this same coin, which I wrote about in my book, Free Will, which it really is the same intuition. The sense of self is the thing that is underwriting this feeling of free will, and which seems to make free will a philosophical problem of lasting interest to people. Now, I've argued at some length in that short book and elsewhere on my blog that the notion of free will doesn't make any scientific or philosophical sense. And ultimately, it doesn't make any experiential sense either, but that's hard. It's a rather harder pill to swallow. So people have spent a lot of time trying to map free will onto reality. So most people start with this sense that they have a very clear experience of free will, and the challenge is just to make it square with what we know about biology and what we know about causality and the obvious fact that no one picked their parents, no one picked their genes, no one picked their environment, no one picked the ways in which their environment sculpted their brains, no one picked the state of their brain and all the charges at every synapse, no one created their neurophysiology, and yet their neurophysiology is the very next thing, the proximate cause of everything that they're going to do and think and intend in this moment and every moment forward. So free will doesn't make sense, and yet everyone knows they've got it. Well, it's because everyone knows they've got this self that is pulling the gears and levers of experience in each moment. But the problem, people's worry on the topic of free will is that if you drink the Kool-Aid and admit that there's no free will, and in this case that there's no self, how do you make sense of moral responsibility? How do you just open the prisons and let everyone out because everyone's not guilty by reason of insanity? And the answer is no. You can still, even if you view people as not truly the authors of their actions, it's just a confluence of causes, just weather patterns, benign or dangerous weather patterns. It still makes sense to defend yourself against the dangerous ones, and we would lock hurricanes up in prison if we could, and that were the only way to keep ourselves safe from them. And so certain people clearly have to be locked up because we don't have a cure for their problem. But if we did have a cure for their problem, if we had a pill that was the cure for psychopathy, for instance, well then we would just give the pill to psychopaths. Then it wouldn't make sense to punish a psychopath who killed a bunch of people because he loves it. If we have a cure for that feeling of sadism that makes somebody want to kill people because he loves it. And it's just because in the absence of a cure, we feel like, well, that evil bastard, he really deserves what's coming to him. If we knew that that was born of a genetic problem, which to some degree it must certainly be, or a genetic and environmental problem, which it must certainly be, we couldn't really blame that person in the way that we want to, and yet we could take all the steps we want to protect ourselves from him, help him if we could help him. The crucial change for me when you get rid of this notion of a self and free will is that it opens up the door to compassion for even the worst people who've ever lived, because you see them not as the ultimate authors of their actions. You see them as, in some sense, as unlucky. But for sheer luck, as a matter of genes and as a matter of environment, none of us, any one of us could have been Saddam Hussein or Hitler or the worst person you want to pick from the pantheon of evil people. You're talking about, in every case, you're talking about people who did not create themselves. So we can consider ourselves lucky not to be murderous psychopaths. And when you meet a murderous psychopath, you can view that person as essentially a great white shark or a grizzly bear or some other creature who can't help but live by this program that is genuinely dangerous for everyone around him. And that doesn't preclude us taking steps to protect ourselves. It's just it undercuts the basis for hatred. It makes no moral sense to hate mentally ill people. And to some degree, not to some degree, to every degree, once we truly understand evil in causal terms, it will be a species of mental illness. There's not. It will be a. The classic example is Charles Whitman, who got into the clock tower at the University of Texas, I think in 66, 64, and he killed his mother and his wife, and then he climbed the clock tower and then shot 30 some odd people and killed, I think, 14. And so this seems like a prototypically evil person who deserves whatever he got, and he got killed by the cops in that case. But he wrote a note, which was effectively his suicide note, which declared that he loved his mom, he loved his wife, he didn't know why he was doing any of this. He had been filled with rages for months that he couldn't control, and he strongly suspected that there was something wrong with his brain, and he recommended that his brain be autopsied so that people could find out what was wrong with him. And they found a glioblastoma in the hypothalamus pushing on the amygdala, which is a totally plausible place for a brain tumor to be eroding somebody's impulse control and giving them rages. And the moment you hear this about Charles Whitman, you think, well, that guy was a pure victim of biology. He was unlucky, and so the tumor is totally exculpatory. Except, and here's the problem, and this problem is coming to us the more we understand the brain, everything is like that tumor. Every fact of neurophysiology is just a more complicated brain tumor. It's and in the end, we'll deliver that same emotional message, which is, this guy was unlucky. This guy was, it's too bad, Jeffrey Dahmer had the genes and life experience that made him a enthusiastic cannibal rapist. We don't have a name for his condition, but his condition was born of causes that preceded his conscious authorship of anything. And so moral responsibility does sort of erode in ways that people fear, and yet in its place we find a basis for compassion and a loss of hatred, and we find no less reason to lock dangerous people up. The only thing that changes is if we had a cure, if with Charles Whitman, if you could catch him before he actually killed everybody and got killed himself, and you just saw him to be a dangerous psychopath, and you scan his brain and you see he's got this golf ball-sized brain tumor, well, then you just perform surgery, and that's, you wouldn't punish him knowing he had this tumor. You would perform surgery on him, and that would be the ethical thing to do. Well, I think the more we understand the mind in terms of the brain, that is going to be the punchline just across the board.